Yeah.
He's sultry.
All right. With step number 11, now we are going to make application to the passage that we've been studying, reading through. We've done our grammatical work on it, outlined work. Paul says in Romans 15, whatever was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. In this passage, we're seeing what we're supposed to do with the Old Testament text. First of all, it was written for our instruction. So the Old Testament text should instruct us. So when we're thinking about making applications, and we're preaching and teaching Old Testament text, remember that there's some instruction that needs to be given with these texts. It's not just information, but actually information that is going to be beneficial. He says, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So the Old Testament Scriptures will instruct us about perseverance. Now, you probably can go from Genesis to Malachi and come up with texts that talk about the importance of perseverance. And the Old Testament texts instruct us by way of encouragement that you can make it. God's people, men and women of old, despite incredible odds, difficulties, challenges, they made it. Just like the heroes of faith in chapter Hebrews 11, those encourage us. And then he talks about the Old Testament is a hope-providing book. That we get hope when we study these Old Testament texts. So when you're applying the Old Testament, make sure that you're keeping in mind what Paul says we can do and should do with those Old Testament texts. And then in 1 Corinthians 10, two passages, he says, now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. So when we're applying Old Testament texts, they're examples. We can appeal to them as examples. In this case, examples of what not to do. Then in verse 11 he says, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So just like he said in Romans 15:4, so also does he repeat here, these Old Testament texts instruct us. If you're failing then in your teaching and preaching to accomplish these goals, then you're not using the Old Testament in the way that God intended. In other words, you're not applying it the way God intended for these texts to be applied. And if you don't ask the right questions, if you're not thinking about those spiritual threads, then you're going to fail to make application. Yes?
The end of that verse, upon whom the ends of the ages have come, is that
right?
Well, I mean, I didn't have any.
Yeah, that's right.
The ends are in. Is that what you're asking? It seemed a little...
Yeah, and I was just wondering exactly what that meant.
That they're in the last dispensation. That there's not another period of history after theirs.
This is it.
Stephen Smith said, the essential skill that every preacher must hone is precision. This is the ability to say exactly what the text is saying with force and unction. while saying only what the text says, no more and no less. That's what we're trying to accomplish, that we are precise, we have studied the text, we know what the text is saying, and now we're able to deliver that text in a very clear, powerful, forceful way. That's good expository, exegetical preaching. When we're talking about application, some other questions that need to be asked. Does the New Testament do anything with this text? Now, most of the time, the answer is going to be no. But you've at least got to ask the question. Like in John 3, Jesus is paralleling himself with the story of the brazen serpent that we read about in the book of Numbers. Well, that's kind of interesting. But the brazen serpent that Moses made, if they looked at it, they would survive the snake bite. If we look to the cross, we'll survive the bite of sin. It's a pretty cool parallel. And so when you're teaching John 3, you definitely want to link that in with background of the book of Numbers, or vice versa. As we just noted, the rebellion in the wilderness is applied to by Paul in 1 Corinthians 10. And then another question, does the New Testament interpret the meaning of an Old Testament passage? Has God already done our exegetical work for us? Well, yeah, on occasion. Like in Deuteronomy 18, there's going to be one likened to Moses that's going to come. Well, Acts 3:23 tells us that's talking about Jesus. In Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5, we read about the next major event that's going to take place is the coming of Elijah. Well, Jesus tells us in Matthew 11, that's John the Baptist. That's who that's talking about. In Joel 2, we read about a time when God's going to pour out His Spirit upon all flesh. Old men will dream dreams, young men see visions, and so on. Well, Peter says this is that which was spoken of by the prophet Joel on the day of Pentecost. So that text is interpreted for us, the meaning and fulfillment of Joel 2. All right, let's move to a whole new category. We're done with the steps. Those are the 11 steps. But one of the questions that we need to address in this class is preaching these Old Testament texts. when we think about exegesis and how it merges with preaching, these Old Testament texts, we have at our disposal 39 awesome books of which to draw material for these sermons. Exciting, powerful, God-inspired text by which we can use in sermons. All right, now these are sub-steps. I thought we should have come up with a different word, steps, but these are not the big 11. These are the small steps in preaching Old Testament texts. First, don't get the cart before the horse. Make sure you've done your exegetical work first. Second, determine the section to be preached. Focus only on the important aspects of the preaching. One time a guy was doing a sermon on rising to be a great man of God. And he was drawing from the text in which Samuel is going through the various sons of Jesse. And then, it's none of those. And Samuel asks, do you have another son? He says, yeah, I've got one. He's out there, taking care of the sheep. Well, go get him. He's the one that is going to be anointed king. And anyway, it describes David as being ruddy, and, well, he gets lost in the description of what that meant. And so we're spending like the next 4 or 5 minutes talking about the ruddiness of David. And I'm thinking,
What's the application?
why are we doing that? What is the point?
Don't be ruddy.
It got us off track. Rising to be a great man of God, from humble beginnings to being a man after God's own heart. That's what we're looking at. And you don't want to get lost in the fact that he kind of had red hair and lights. Well, who cares? I mean, it's something that's in the text, so it's something that we acknowledge, but it's not something that's significant to the point that's being made.
Did he really have red hair? I was just curious. I didn't mean like mine, but
He was short, too. All right, then third, work on your outline. Just by way of repeating what you've already learned in homiletics, but in the intro, remind us of what's going on. You don't have forever to lay an extensive background for an Old Testament text. Just remind us of what's going on. If it's a prophetic book, remind us that the nation of Israel hasn't been carried off into captivity yet. Or remind us that the nation of Israel has been carried off into captivity, but Judah still remains in the land, but they're about to be taken off. Remind us of what's going on in whatever context it is. Saul had been chosen to be king. But because of his failure to obey the Lord in 1 Samuel 15, God had determined, I'm going to get another guy. I'm replacing him. That's the background. That's the story of talking about David from humble beginnings to being a great man of God. Yeah? The introduction should lay that groundwork. The body should have main points that come from the text. Sometimes the text will, in fact, give you kind of the outline, like we saw in Isaiah 51 and 52, Joel 2, the before them phrase. Sometimes, though, it's more of an idea that we're transitioning from point to point, but those are a little bit more tricky. Most of the time, you want the text to actually develop your points for you. And then the conclusion, the lessons learned from the text. Did these people in the Old Testament learn the lesson? So what about us today? Are we going to learn the lesson? And then, number 4, don't force an application. Every text has applications. If you can't find them, then you haven't done enough exegetical work. Have you heard the phrase proof texting? P-R-O-O-F, proof texting. Proof texting is where you're making a point, an application from a text, but that text really isn't making that point. Now on the surface, it kind of seems like it is. And so you're yanking a text out of its context in order to prove a point that that text is not trying to prove. That text is not trying to say. Well, that's proof texting, and those are very dangerous things to do. We always need to make sure that when we're preaching or we're making an application from an Old Testament text, that is the application that's in that text. So, yeah, Mark.
Would that be the same as pretexting?
The words again.
No.
I heard someone call it pretexting.
Well,
Putting into the text what isn't there.
putting into the text,
Putting into the text what
that's what
isn't
they're calling proof texting.
That was chapter 5.
That's
Presupposition.
that's in the book, huh? This is what Stewart in his Old Testament exegesis said. Indeed, you can hardly expect your congregation to accept your suggested application of a passage solely on your authority. They need to be shown how the application is based on a proper comprehension of the passage's meaning, and they will probably not take the application to heart unless this is clear to them. You don't want them walking away saying, well, that's what he got out of it, but I sure didn't see it. Because if that's what they're walking away with, and the lesson was a huge crash and burn, it was a flop. But if you've walked them through that, and they're going, man, then you've really hit a home run with that Old Testament text. Like going through 1 Kings, in the sight of the Lord, in the sight of the Lord. And people say, man, now I'm seeing that. And they get something from it, and then the application that God sees what we're doing, good and bad. Then that's a natural transition into that application. Avoid using homiletical commentaries. Now, I could have said avoid using commentaries, but since we're talking about preaching, Stewart had this to say: this can be counterproductive since the homiletical commentaries are, for the most part, exegetically shallow.
Would this be one of those steps, the sub-steps you were talking about? Avoid using homiletical commentaries?
Not a sub-step, just more information.
Oh, okay.
So as much as you might like to use pulpit commentaries and stuff like that, they're not going to be helpful exegetically, because those men that made up those are preachers, and they're just making sermons from various texts, but they haven't really done the exegetical work first, and so that's counterproductive, working against what you really want to accomplish.
Now, in our reading, there was some that they said the book recommended, or book we're using, of exegetical commentary on this, or exegetical commentary on that. Would you, in your opinion, are those?
The exegetical commentaries, there are some good ones out there.
Okay.
But as far as any homiletical commentary that's exegetical, I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
Did they have some?
Let me look.
I think in the book they were talking about for the history. If you want to find out the history, they said they mentioned commentaries. So to look to find out like what was going on, in Corinth during that time.
Yeah. Okay, let's do some practice on what we're talking about. Look at Exodus 32, and we're just going to kind of go through the various genre.
Gene Wright?
Gene Ray. And so you're going to preach a sermon on Exodus 32, 11 through 14. All right, we're looking at this. God is angry, and he tells Moses that I'm going to destroy them, and I'm going to make of you a great nation. All right, so there's our introduction. Now we want to draw the body of our sermon from verses 11 through 14. Or actually, our conclusion is in verse 14. So the body of our lesson is in verses 11, 12, and 13. Does anybody see what's going on here? What's Moses doing? He's laying out an argument why God shouldn't do that. Well, how many arguments does he actually give? He gives 3 arguments. Argument number 1 is in verse 11. O Lord, why dost thou in anger burn against thy people, whom thou hast brought out from the land of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? What's he saying? You've already done so much for these people. Why turn on them now? And then, verse 12. Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, with evil intent he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to destroy them from the face of the earth? So, argument number 2, it gave a false message to the Egyptians. Don't want to do that. And then argument number 3, verse 13, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, thy servants to whom thou didst swear by thyself, and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens. So, argument number 3, don't do this because of the promises you made to the fathers. So did Moses' arguments win the day?
Yes.
Verse 14, so the Lord changed his mind. So Moses proved himself to be a worthy leader of God's people. And as he passed on pride and offered 3 compelling arguments of why God should not do what he was proposing to do there in verse 10. All right, now that's exegesis. We're identifying what's there. We saw an introduction from the text. We saw the main 3 points from the text. And then we drew our conclusion from the text. Now, I don't know if in your mind you're thinking, I could preach that. I could develop a good sermon from that. But you could, and it would be very exegetical because you're talking about the text application. Talking about the text application. So you say, think of how much God has already done. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Why should our souls not be destroyed? Why should God not turn on us? Well, anyway, you get the point. You can make application from text like this. So, 3 reasons why God shouldn't do this. Why, when you've already done so much, he asks. Why give the Egyptians a false impression? And then remember your promises to the fathers. So, he's got 2 whys and a remember in which he's appealing to God not to do what God is proposing. Another aspect to preaching the Old Testament and in law has to do with this writing, I don't even know what to call it, a style, I suppose. It's called a chiasm. Have you heard this word before? Chiasm? Well, Genesis 11 is a perfect illustration of a chiasm. And the way that you start identifying a chiasm is when you see basically the same point repeated a second time later on in the text. Which is what happens in Genesis 11:1. He talks about the whole earth. And then in 11:9, he talks about the whole earth. And then you see point B, he used the same language and the same words. And then on point B1 there at the bottom, the Lord confused the language of. And then point C, talk about Shinar and settled there. And then C1, Babel, because there. Anyway, we don't need to walk through all of this, but a chiasm is basically where you've got two stories that fold in on themselves. All right, so we've got the whole narrative that goes like this. This is verse 1, that's verse 11. And then verse 1 and verse 11 merges together. But the thing that's super cool about a chiasm is that middle fold is the significant point. That is the main point that's being made in the chiasm. And so as we fold in this particular text, we get to point G there, and that is the Lord came down. If you're going to get anything out of the story of the Tower of Babel, is that God is not going to let men go and do what they want to do without eventual intervention. The Lord is going to come down.
Do we have examples of chiasms in secular writings of this time?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you get good at like picking that out of the text? Because I do not. I mean, that I can see it when you got it laid out like that, but there's no way I would have come up with that.
Yeah,
I'll
that's
show you
a
after
fair
class.
question. And you'll get to where you start seeing it. Now, what I do is this: is I'm reading through something, and we've been using the phrase bookends. If I say, well, we started with that, and now he's saying the same thing again, then I'm going to start asking, is this possibly a chiasm?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then you kind of move in, and I say, well, there's nothing else that lines up. Okay, it's not a chiasm. Those are just bookends. There's nothing more to it than that.
Can you just tell us every chiasm?
Can you email it?
That may be a lot easier.
All right, here's the master list of all biblical chiasms.
Can you
I'd
load
buy
those
that
things?
book.
Okay, let's talk about preaching narrative. Hayes and Duvall actually did, I thought, a very good job of discussing narrative and preaching narratives, both advantages and disadvantages. Page 335 on the third edition. Here are their points, and this is not a part of the assigned reading, so a lot of you, unless you were trying to get the extra credit, would not have got this far into the book. But why preach narrative? Well, first of all, it's just interesting. These biblical stories are just fascinating. They're attention-getting. And so those are always a real plus, both to adults and to children. I never get tired of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Never get tired of somebody retelling the story of David and Goliath. Or the 10 plagues. So, it's just interesting. Second, they pull us into the action. There's just something about seeing ourselves with the slingshot and 5 stones. But that's what these stories do. They draw us in. And now we're the Elijah on Mount Carmel. We're the Abraham that's offering Isaac. Narratives usually depict real life, and so they're easy to relate to. we talking about Abraham and Sarah's not able to have kids, and we can relate to that story. Not that maybe we personally were married to a woman that couldn't have children, although that might be the case. But we can at least understand the human emotion that would go along with the disappointment of not being able to have children. And both from Abraham's point of view and from Sarah's point of view. So these are real people in real life situations that, even though we're talking about thousands of years ago, the parallels to our lives with hopes, with disappointments, with conflicts, we relate to those. And so that's always an advantage of narrative. Fourth, narrative can portray the ambiguities and complexities of life. God announces to Abraham that he's going to have a son, and he does have that son. And now Abraham absolutely is thrilled, and he's in love with Isaac, and then God says, okay, I want you to go sacrifice him. That's a twist that you just didn't see coming. But it's one of those complexities. It's one of those things that all of a sudden my life was rocking along pretty good, and then this happens. Well, how do we deal with the challenges that we face in life? Narratives are good at helping us deal with things that are unexpected. Narratives are easy to remember. So I'm talking about David and Goliath. You're going, yeah. Talking about Elijah and Mount Carmel. Yeah, I got that. You know these stories. They're easy to remember. And chances are you've heard them once. You don't forget them. They're just that kind of great story that we can put it in our minds. Sixth advantage of narrative is God can include himself as one of the characters. Like we're reading about the condition of the people in Genesis 6 and how they become very evil. And now God is interjecting himself into the story. God is sorry that he made man. God is disappointed over the sinful choices that men have made. And so we learn something about the nature and character of God, that he's not immune to emotions. He's got feelings. And that when we choose to sin, we're hurting God. Okay? A narrative has those kind of advantages. Number 7, narratives are holistic. We see characters struggle, but we often see resolution of their struggles. We talk about defining somebody or learning something about somebody, warts and all. Well, the Old Testament characters are warts and all. Talking about Abraham, and Abraham goes, and the Egyptian Pharaoh is kind of drawn to Sarah, so what does Abraham do? He lies. She's my sister. Well, not so good. Or we talk about holistic, and we see the whole character. Like the story of Joseph, and the ups and downs with Joseph. Joseph in prison. Joseph second in command. We see the whole story about him. Our David is a great example of seeing the struggles, the highs and lows, the challenges that he had with his own faith, the sinful choices that he made, rising above those sinful choices. Those are the advantages of narrative. And then 8, they relate short incidents and events to a bigger overall story. Like what happened with Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Just gets a few verses, but it adds to the bigger picture of this man of God and why he is a man of God. Or David and Bathsheba. Well, that was something that gets 10, 11, 12 verses in 1 Samuel 12, but it plays a significant role in the character and the development of the man David. Narratives have some disadvantages, though. The meaning of the narrative can be subtle or ambiguous and not clearly stated. The casual reader may miss it altogether. All right, let me illustrate that. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17. All right, here is the chapter in which we got David and Goliath. And as you've heard sermons preached on this text, you've had Bible classes on this text, and maybe even have done both yourself. And if your experience has been like my experience, that when I see people work us through this text, they're just telling the story like history. And if they try to put it in a larger context, that larger context will be something like, this is why God ended up choosing David to be king, because he's got this kind of character. But when we look at 1 Samuel 17, we're really seeing a tremendous spiritual lesson that's going on. Now, we know all the particulars. Goliath is the huge guy that's a trained soldier. David, the shepherd boy that's got 5 rocks. All right. That's, insurmountable odds, it seems like. We know that story. But notice this flow that goes through the text. In verse 10, Goliath says, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. All right, so the gauntlet has been laid down. The challenge has been made. He is defying the people of God. The ranks of Israel have now been challenged. Then verse 26, David asks, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Okay, so he's defied the ranks. Israel is being reproached. David goes on to say, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Now he doesn't say us. He should taunt us, the armies of the living God. So he's defying Israel, and David is saying, how can this guy get away with taunting God's people? So now this has transitioned into a spiritual battle between good and evil, between righteous and unrighteous, God and Satan. Look at verse 36. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. So now we've got that phrase repeated again. Verse 37.
Are those the same Hebrew word that occurs every time in all three of those passages you looked at?
The word taunt?
Yeah, you said verse 10, verse 27, and verse 36. Are they all the same word?
I'm not sure about verse 10. I have to look that one up. Then look at verse 37. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. All right, so he's defying us. David says the Lord is going to be the one that's going to deliver. Then drop down to verse 45. Now he finally confronts Goliath. You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. There's our word. This day, verse 46, the Lord will deliver you up into my hands. And then, if you really want to get the spiritual lesson, look at last part of 46 and 47. That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So what is this whole story all about? It's all about this spiritual battle between good and evil, and that God will deliver his people. God is going to deliver. And he doesn't need a sword, and he doesn't need a spear to do it. Well, you can rock right through 1 Samuel 17 and never even get around to making that point. Never back up and say, okay, folks, what is this really all about? When we talk about David and Goliath, what is this story really all about? Well, that's what it's about. What is identified very clearly in verse 47. God wants us to see that no matter how great the odds may seem, if we're his, he will deliver us. Okay? Now that's something I can take home with. Now it's more than a cool story. It's something that means something to me. Because I've got my Goliaths, I've got my challenges, and so do you. And I've got these hurdles that I face and these brick walls that I come up against, and they can be discouraging, and they can seem unconquerable. Well, but with God on your side, victory is assured. Okay? Well, so the casual reader may miss it. You may miss that thread that's going through. He defied the ranks of Israel. That started the whole process. All right, so now what does that mean? Well, you had the ranks of Israel that are cowering in fear of the mighty Goliath, but you've got one shepherd boy with faith that wins the day. Can you be that David? Can you be like him despite what seems like the insurmountable odds? Well, it depends on what? On your relationship with God. That's what it depends on. If your relationship with God is what it should be, like David's was, then you'll conquer your Goliaths. Okay. Enough preaching. But it's cool stuff.
Amen.
And it's very, very powerful in preaching narrative. All right, second, the reader may get enthralled with the narrative as a story and miss the meaning. Illustration of that, well, what we just looked at illustrates it, but, you know, I talked about Elijah on Mount Carmel. We get wrapped up in the all day, all morning long, the prophets of Baal, and they're cutting themselves, and they're crying out, they're doing all this stuff, and Elijah's kind of laughing at them, and, you know, maybe he's gone to the bathroom and stuff like that. Well, we can get lost in all that and then fail to really see the meaning of what's happening. Because the people of Israel had lost faith in God. They didn't think that God was either real or, if he was real, was going to do anything for them. So they had turned to worshiping Baal. And these prophets of Baal were their prophets. Well, we can get sidetracked where we're replacing God with things that are not significant. Well, so when we think about what's happening, Elijah wins people back to God through that event. Well, we don't want to get so enthralled in the narrative that we miss the meaning. Third, the reader may assume that since the literature is narrative, it deals only with history and not theology. Now, those of you that know me at all know that this is one of my big pet peeves with teaching Old Testament texts, as it's just history. Made the point before, but we'll make it again here, and that is, if these Bible books are meant to be historical, they're pathetic records of history. Because major events in history are glossed over, and relatively insignificant events are given considerable press. It's not history. And so, you know, Hayes and Duvall say, well, it's theology. Well, that's okay. But the point is there are spiritual applications that are being made. And then a fourth disadvantage to narrative is a reader may read too much theology into the narrative. And what they mean there is allegorizing.
And by allegorizing, they mean
the Jewish allegorists said that the 5 smooth stones that David had were the Torah. That's why 5. And that Leviticus is what brought Goliath down.
They believe in the literal Goliath?
Oh yeah. Yeah, but that's the real surface.
That's superficial.
Understanding. What?
That's superficial.
That's superficial. Yeah. Understanding that the stones are the Torah, that's allegory.
Are they the ones that sought for the higher meaning in everything?
Right.
I thought you just couldn't fit 6 in there.
So you're.
That's why Joshua is not part of the law.
So you're always trying to transition and get to that hidden spiritual meaning, the allegory. All right, so if the 5 stones are the Torah, then the Torah brought down Goliath. So who's Goliath? In the allegory.
Sin.
Might be sin, might be Satan. The Jews believed that it was paganism. The Torah was what conquered the pagan, godless world and introduced them to God's true law. Now, when you read 1 Samuel 17, you probably didn't get any of that, did you? So, anyway, that's always
Me and
one
Dara
of
did.
the dangers. All right, they talk about 6 important elements that are a part of narrative. The plot, the setting, the characters, viewpoint of the narrator, like in 1 Samuel 17, the comparison or the contrast isn't so much with David and Goliath as it is David and Saul. That's the contrast that's actually being developed over several chapters. So when we read these narratives, we're thinking about that comparison or that contrast. And then irony. Joseph has to be sold as a slave in order for him to end up becoming second in command in Egypt. That's ironic how that worked out. Okay, we'll pick up there this afternoon.